I was hiking in Mount Zion National Park, beautiful, beautiful park, and there was this Buddhist monk who was selling a bunch of literature, so just a bunch of books from different traditions, and one caught my eye. It was the Bhagavad Gita. It's one of the core texts of the Hindu tradition. So there's the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita, and together they kind of compose what you could call the Bible, if you wanted to be overly simplistic. And I purchased it, and it kind of was wearing on me. It was in my backpack as I'm going, and this question started to haunt me, which was, how should I feel about it? Is it worth my time? Is it something that is valuable to me? Should I throw it away? Should I wholeheartedly accept every word? Where should I hold this in my mind? And so that question was kind of gnawing at me, and I think I've come to a really solid answer, and I'd like to walk you through this. So the first main pillar in this whole conversation is kind of a more fundamental point about the brain. And so there was an interesting experiment done in the 1920s. It was a natural experiment. So during the 1920s, the Soviet Union was going through rapid industrialization. And there were farmers who lived in the Ukraine area, and they had kind of preserved this agrarian lifestyle of just farming and going through the usual routine pre-industrial lifestyle. And they preserved that mindset too. And through the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization, they were going to quickly transition into factory workers, like overnight. And so some sociologists decided to study them before and after to see what happens to the brain during that transition. And so they did a bunch of cognitive tests. And one of the more interesting ones is worth discussing. They laid out a bunch of cards with different pictures on them, and they asked these farmers to organize them into two groups that made sense to them, however way they saw fit. And so the pictures were a bird, a pig, a gun, and a knife. And the way we might consider organizing these is, put the two animals together, so a bird and a pig, and then the knife and the gun. And that seems pretty sensible. I can't think of too many other ways to organize it. But that actually wasn't what most pre-industrial farmers did. The farmers grouped it more by task instead. So they would put the bird and the rifle together because you hunt birds with a rifle. And so it doesn't make sense to have a knife in the mix, and the knife goes with the pig because you need to butcher the pig. And so the organization for them was more task-based more often. And post-industrialization, it tended to be more concept-based, of tools versus animals. And this is actually a super critical point about your brain and how we all think, which is that abstract concepts aren't something you're born with. You learn them through necessity. You need to have context that forces you to learn abstract ideas. And discovering them on your own is quite difficult, but being taught them is fairly straightforward. And we rely on a massive number of these every day. You could hardly have a political conversation without 15 to 20 concepts that are really hard to grasp and have taken years for you to learn. But the end result is that you can have a productive conversation about a very complex topic. And so this sort of abstract thinking that we've learned over time, it can express itself in multiple ways, and it's hard to tell which way of thinking is correct. And there's a book that is very fascinating called Science Rules, and it's tracking the development of the scientific method. And during the development of the scientific method, you can kind of see humans grappling with, how do you think correctly? We have all of these things that we need to have complex conversations, all these ideas and concepts, but how can we tell whether they're right or wrong? Or how can we answer questions about the natural world in a way that's likely to get the right answer? Or how can we check our answers? And so this book kind of traces the development of the scientific method, but it's really the development of how to think. And those two concepts kind of crystallize something for me, which is that the human brain is very plastic, and it's very malleable, and it's really difficult to tell if you're thinking in a way that's correct. If the way that you live your life, your general cognitive landscape, are you living that in a way that leads to a happy and healthy life, or are you leading it in a toxic and unhealthy way? And it's really hard to tell because you can maybe see immediate results of insulting your friend and it being negative, but longer term results are harder to see, and it's harder to know that you've screwed up until you have screwed up and it's very obvious. And so over time, we kind of build up these answers to questions. There's a lot of questions that you have to answer in your day-to-day life about, how do you interact with your friends, and how do you do these things, or what do concepts mean for conversation. And what seems to be the case is that religious traditions are a way in which prehistoric humans and more recent historic humans compile answers to big questions and pass them on to the next generation. So as we're trying to learn things, it's so much easier to be taught than to discover for yourself. And what seems to be happening is religious traditions are a way of passing lessons down the line. And as it gets passed down, each generation refines it a little bit more. This is really clear with oral history in a lot of ways, because each teller of an oral history will vary it in a certain way, which adds more wisdom from their own life. And over the course of 30, 40, 500 generations, you end up with an oral tradition which is just packed with ideas and concepts and metaphors that could be super helpful for our day-to-day lives. There are questions that we have of how do you interact with your friends? What does it mean to get married? Should you get married? What does it take to raise kids? What does it mean to lie? What does it mean to be honest? All of these things have been challenges facing humans for thousands and thousands of years. And so as these religious traditions develop, they start packing in bits of wisdom over time that help us get closer to answers on those. And so when it comes to the original question, should we value religious texts? I think that the answer is quite clear, which is we should. If you sit down with one of these texts and you go through the pages, you can parse through these ideas and you can sort out things, whether they're helpful or not helpful. And I find every time that I do, if I find things that I agree with and things I can apply to my life, I'm much better off. But even if I don't find things I agree with, things that I find gruesome or abhorrent, they still benefit me too. I find I become a sharper thinker by having to look in the face ideas I find uncomfortable and explain why I think they're wrong. Why don't I agree with that certain principle from that one book? Or why is that one principle really just not fit for modern life? Those sorts of conflicts of ideas are really great for sharpening how you think. And so as we look at religious texts and their progress over time, it becomes really clear that with how flexible our brain is, how hard it is to tell whether we're thinking correctly, and how jam-packed religious texts are with answers and wisdom from the previous generations, it seems quite obvious to me that they are very valuable for our day-to-day life, and we should certainly sit down and read one.